G'day, Geoff Lewis here from Seriously Series, and welcome to another episode in what I'm calling Trip Prep. In the first episode we looked at obviously the camping gear that I typically take in a Series Land Rover, particularly the Series 2, on sort of a 4-day trip or so. In this episode though, I'm going to talk about the toolkit that I actually take along with me. We'll look at what kind of spanners do I use, what kind of spare parts do I take, and why do I take these particular tools, what uses do they actually have, and how you can look at actually building up your own toolkit, particularly if you're just starting out with these vehicles or an off-road going vehicle in general. So it should be an interesting video as always, so as I always say, if this sounds like a video that's of interest to you, stay tuned. So rightio, so myself and the Series 2, we've done a couple of trips over the last month. We ventured into the Great Western Woodlands, which is the largest Mediterranean woodland in the world, and there's a number of reasons for that, which I won't go into in this video. And then we also completed the Holland track, which is a track that I actually did in the Parenti a few years ago. And the Parenti's off over that way. I've just moved it out of the shed, and it was fantastic doing the trip in the Series 2. It was just great. I had door tops off, and it was just nice to get back to basics. I really like the Series 3 and the Parenti, but you know, the Series 2 is where it really all started for me, and it's the vehicle that I actually drove over from Tasmania five getting close to 6 years ago. And one of the things I love about it is just the pure simplicity of it. A Series 2 is very different to a Series 3, and any die-hard Land Rover enthusiast will know exactly what I'm talking about. But the tools that you actually take along with you are very similar. Now, as I said, this is the toolkit that I typically take on sort of a 4-day trip. And some of the spare parts that I usually take aren't here because I've had to use them on the Series 2 before heading off on the trip. So one of the things I always take is a coil. I always take a spare set of points, and I always take a condenser. And these are basically key components of your ignition system. I always have a set of spark plugs with me too, because they're usually pretty good, but you never know if one's going to foul up or not. So they're sort of the main spare parts I take. Other spare parts I take are axle seals, whether you get neoprene or I think I've got a leather one here. Leather, pretty old one that one, I should probably toss it. And then lock washers. They're typically for the wheel bearings, and the wheel bearings do tend to come loose, particularly on the front, because if you think about it, when you're steering, all the forces going left and right pushing on the wheel as you're turning those left and right hand bends, obviously it causes the wheel bearing to obviously warp and wear a little bit more than the rear. So you do have to check obviously the play on the wheel bearing and adjust it from time to time. Feeler gauges are really good. If you don't have a set of those and you're heading out bush, make sure you take a hacksaw. Now this is a little bush mechanic trick. The hacksaw blade is roughly about the right sort of thickness for your points in your distributor, which I believe is 0.45 millimeters. I stand corrected, which should also be 0.16 of an inch. So the hacksaw blade, you can just run that in, run it out, and that'll get you pretty close. Might be off by a little bit, but as long as your car runs, it doesn't really matter, it's going to get you home. What else? Well, the key thing is with the tools that you take, is that they're actually useful tools. There's no point taking a spare differential with you for a 4-day trip, and depending on what axle configuration, there's probably no point taking a heap of spare axles with you either, prop shafts and all the rest, because the vehicle itself will be horrendously overloaded. So, as I said, take stuff that's useful. I usually take an assortment of screwdrivers, large Phillips head, sort of medium-sized Phillips head, and obviously a large posi drive or flat-bladed screwdriver, which I use obviously for the freewheeling hubs on the Series 2, and obviously like any large flat-bladed screwdriver, it finds many other uses of the cold variety. Stilsons are always a handy one. These are a set that I inherited, made in England, so they've got to be good. So they're good for particularly taking the locking diff in the rear apart, which sometimes I need to do in order to replace the stub axle seal. Shifter is absolutely critical too. This one's a bit of an oldie but a goodie. Doesn't necessarily have to, you don't have to have new tools. A lot of my tools, not tools that I've got here, but a lot of the tools I have back in Tassie I purchased from markets, because I simply just didn't have the money to buy brand new tools or brand new good quality tools. And a lot of the second-hand tools out there, the steel quality is much better than what you're going to buy for the same price at a hardware store. So that's another top tip there. Pry bars are really handy, even the small ones, for getting your lock washer out of the actual stub axle housing. A good pair of pliers, thin nosed, and obviously the broader variety are very good. And depending on, once again, what axle configuration you have, you will need to take circlip pliers with you too. I'm talking a lot about the stub axles because they're the one thing that you become very familiar with, because the seals for the Series Land Rover only have one lip, so it takes just one little bit of sand, one little bit of imperfection in the steel, and that actually cuts it, and then all your axle fluid or all your grease comes out and cocoons your brake pads. So you'll become very familiar with that if you haven't done a few trips already. Box spanner is a really good one. If you haven't got one, get one. Well worth it. I find the hollow box spanner like this is much better than an impact socket. The impact sockets are very heavy, and it's all about keeping your weight down. So this is great. It's obviously got a hole in it. What I tend to do is I get the large screwdriver and I just put that straight through, and I can use that to tighten it up or loosen it off. Grease gun is a great one too. Some people like to have it obviously in a container. I find that doesn't work out here in the desert, because what loves getting into containers with grease? Sand. And when you've got sand and grease, it's no good to you. This way it keeps it all contained, and obviously I just keep bearing grease in here, so I can use it for a variety of applications. I generally use grease when I'm putting in a paper gasket, so I can just squeeze off a little bit onto my finger and just run it around either surface, sit the gasket on there, and then actually put whatever, I guess, piece of casting that I need to bolt on there. And the advantage of using grease over oil, if you put oil on there, it starts sliding down the face. If it's vertical, grease will actually stick there and hold in place, so it's much easier. So bearing grease is the one to use there. Don't use molybdenum. Now, moving on to spanners, if you've got a proper Land Rover or a proper vehicle, you will need to carry a set of Whitworth spanners, and yes, there is one missing. It's in the toolbox. These are relatively cheap. I bought this from a nut and bolt store in Tasmania called Nuts and Bolts Tasmania, a very original name, and they haven't changed their size, so they're pretty good quality. But I've used these a lot. You'll find there's a lot of Whitworth bolts and nuts on the transmission and the engine, and particularly certain parts of the axle assembly on the Series 2. There's less Whitworth bolts and nuts on the Series 3 as they slowly phase them out. But even the new Defender that's come out now, I bet there's at least a few Whitworth nuts and bolts on there just for good measure. So, Whitworth set of spanners. And the other thing that you want to have, and I haven't got it here today because I couldn't find it on the bench, is a set of Whitworth sockets. And I use Eurotech. I've had them for probably 10 or 12 years. I think they were $80 Australian, not very expensive, but they've put up with a lot of punishment, and just like the spanners, they're still the same size. So it's great. Now, I'll just get these. Now, getting back to brands, a lot of people are very loyal to particular makes and manufacturers. I don't really believe in that per se. It comes down to the individual. So basically what I take, or my sort of tack on things, is buy the best possible quality kit that you can for the budget that you have at hand, and you can always get something better down the track. So with this, the tools that I've got, they're not exactly, flash. They're not all snap-on kit and sick chrome this and all the rest, but they certainly do the job. And this is one toolkit that's a prime example of that. There's a brand here in Australia, or an automotive store called Repco, and I bought this spanner set, it doesn't look like it, 5 years ago, and prior to that I had another one for about 5 years or so. It was about $200, and it's fantastic spanner set. But the great thing about it is you've got imperial and you've got metric all in the same roll. For many years I used to carry two individual rolls, one of metric, one of imperial, and it was an absolute pain because you would forget one, you'd leave one at home, and then you'd be struggling and battling away with the metric set, or vice versa, depending on what vehicle you're in. This way you've got everything you need all in one roll, and it's great. The other thing is, with a lot of Repco tools, is they come with a lifetime warranty. So if there's any massive defect in the tools themselves, you can actually get a new one. I had a Repco set of ratchet spanners, and I think it was the 13mm, which is a very common size. It's similar to 1/2 inch, and I actually used it so much I wore the ratchet mechanism out. So I went back in there and they just gave me a new spanner, and off I went. So how good's that? You're getting good value for money. King Chrome's a pretty good brand out here in Australia, and I've got a 1/4 inch socket set, metric and imperial. This is great for all those really small little nuts and bolts, particularly around the dash and for electrical items, and particularly for hose clamps. I never ever use a Phillips head screwdriver or a posi drive or flat bladed screwdriver on my hose clamps. It just ends in tears. Always use this. So really handy. The next thing you want is I believe is a good 1/2 inch socket set. 3/8 in my mind, and no offence, is a waste of time. I've dealt with it in the past and they're just no good. Get yourself a decent socket set. That's my little take on it anyway. So this one here is obviously King Chrome again. It's a very well used set. I've had it for about 5 or 6 years, and this is of the lock-on variety. And the great thing about this is, particularly working on more mature vehicles, a lot of the nuts and bolts, they get burrs, and the actual edges of the hexagon head slowly wear over time. And this set really makes a big difference if you're pulling apart a vehicle or stripping it down. You've just bought a Land Rover, you've just bought a FJ Land Cruiser, you're stripping it down, you're getting it ready to obviously get prepped, so then you can start the process of restoring it. The good thing about it is the sockets, they have these extra notches on the actual corners of the hexagon head, and so it can actually bite into the head a little bit more, or I guess bite's not the right word, but it's got a greater circumference, a greater surface area, so you can pull those bolts out, pull those nuts out with greater ease. So fantastic set, really worth it. One other socket set that I would recommend is Sichrome. Sichrome have a really interesting socket design. A lot of sockets, I think, have 6 sides. I stand corrected there. What Sichrome actually has, and I'll try and show you a picture, they've actually got tiny little ridges all the way through, and this means you can get, once again, a greater surface area actually onto that bolt, onto that nut, and you've got less of a chance of actually damaging the nut by it actually slipping. So that's something well worth keeping in mind. Right, what else have we got? We need a good knockometer or a club hammer. This one's a king chrome one, but basically anything with a good sturdy handle is worthwhile. I've used some over the years where the handle's been a bit suspect, and I've been left with the handle but not the head, so make sure it's got a good handle. Bottle jack is absolutely critical. Now, this bottle jack I've had for about a year. I actually wore out my other bottle jack, that's how much I used it. This is fantastic for on the side of, I guess not on the side, but I guess field repairs and maintenance. You can jack it up if you need to jack up a few wheels. Obviously get your trusted axe and go and chop a tree down, or preferably go and get some dead wood, get a nice stump and shove it underneath there and use that as an axle stand. Alternatively, if you don't have that, and this is obviously, I'm not recommending it, I'm just suggesting it, use a steel jerry can, and you can actually use that as a bit of an axle stand too. Now, the great thing about the bottle jack is, obviously, as I said, you can use it for field repairs, but you can use it as a recovery piece of equipment, particularly in sand. Now, you need to think about it a little bit. Now, I'll tell you an example. I was out in the Great Victorian Desert with a mate of mine, Jace, and it was actually filming the 2nd episode of Golden Quest. And we'd gone down the sand dune, and I'd said to Jace, geez, that's a big sand dune, I don't think we're going to get up it. Anyway, after multiple attempts, we didn't get up it. Shock horror. The Land Rover, or Series 2, got right up to the top, and then it just got stuck on the soft sand. So what were we going to do? We didn't have max tracks. They're not really period correct. So what we did is we used a bit of initiative, and I got the bottle jack and I put it underneath the front bumper, because it's solid steel on these vehicles, or pretty much solid steel. And what I did is I knew the bottle jack wouldn't be able to jack up and actually reach the bottom of the front bumper. So I built up a massive mound of sand and then put the jacking plate on top of that, and then put the bottle jack on top of that too. And so it basically had that much gap between the top of the bottle jack and the bottom of the bumper. And that then meant I was able to actually jack up the entire front of the car. We were able to slip some logs underneath the front wheels, and with Jason jumping up and down on the bumper, we slowly crawled straight out of the quagmire that we'd got ourselves into. So the bottle jack is a fantastic piece of recovery equipment. Never ever underestimate it. So you can do wonders with it. And I've talked about a friend of mine who actually got this very vehicle stuck in quicksand on the west coast, and he got it out with nothing more than a bottle jack, a chainsaw and a heap of driftwood. And he basically just cut the driftwood into rounds and just slowly went round the car, jacking off the chassis, and jacked it up so it was back up to surface, put a heap of driftwood out in front of it and just drove straight out. It's amazing what you can do. You really don't need a lot of fancy kit. You just need to obviously read a little bit and try and think outside the box. And if you give something a go and it doesn't work, don't worry, there's always a plan B. So really handy bottle jack, and then obviously a good shovel. Now I don't carry a long handled shovel. I used to, but it was just an absolute pain because I've got a short wheelbase vehicle. So I just use this one here. It's great. It fits on the Parenti, obviously with tool mounts, fits on the Series 3 with tool mounts, and it fits in the back of the, as you can see here, the Series 2 perfectly. It's just the right length. And I use a viscous axe for in the Series 2 because once again it's the right length, and I just really like them. They're just a really nice axe. They've got a good head, and obviously you can get a really good edge on them, and they just keep it. So that's really good. Radiator hoses, getting back onto spare parts, are really important. This one here obviously is not a standard Land Rover radiator hose, and this is something really important. I was chatting to a friend of mine about this the other day. You don't have to have a hose that necessarily matches the vehicle. You just have to have one that's pretty close. So this has got the right S-bend for a lower radiator hose. So I can actually cut it off probably sort of here, and I can get it to fit and trim a little bit off there too. That means I've got this little bit of extra radiator hose that I can use on another part of the cooling system. So essentially I've got 2 radiator hoses in one, so I'm not going to lose it. Obviously that's good enough for the top radiator hose, for coming from the tank into the thermostat. And then one other, I guess, electrical component I always take with me is an ignition switch. Now this is something really important, and the reason I'm telling you this is it's from experience. Everything I'm telling you here today is from experience. I'm not interested in myths and all the rest. It's facts here. It's seriously series. I've been through 3 ignition switches in the Series 2 in the course of nearly 14 years. I think, 14 years that I've had it. And these ignition switches are obviously getting quite rare now. And you have to remember, they're 50 years old. And the electrics in these vehicles, they don't actually have any proper relays that we think of nowadays. They have 2 copper relays, and they have 1 fuse, and that's it. And that runs the whole car. So they tend to burn out the switches. Now, to switch the car on, you obviously have your key here, and you switch it on like so. Now, that actually runs through the center of the switch. That can burn out. So what do? Well, what you can do is you can reroute it. So usually, you're just wanting to get to where you want to go. So obviously your park lights aren't really that important. So you can run everything through the park lights. So to do that, you then, instead of starting the car using that system, you just pull the key out and you just need to flick it to standby. What happens if standby fails? Well, then you really need to start getting concerned, because then you've got to run it through your headlights, and you're not going to have any lights in the vehicle, or headlights in the vehicle. So you've pretty much got 3 chances before you're completely stuffed. And the places that I go and the trips that I do, I really don't think it's worthwhile. And you can pick up these second hand. You can buy new ones, but the new ones are nowhere near as good as the old ones. And I've found this out the hard way. I paid a lot of money for a brand new one, and it failed on me, and I couldn't understand why. And anyway, myself and a friend, we pulled it apart, and we found why. All the components on the inside were all plastic, and they melted. So, whereas this here is basically all brass and Bakelite. So you've got a better chance of this actually lasting than obviously the newer switches out there. Now, a couple other things worth taking is, obviously, it's a bit sad, but duct tape or 100-mile-hour tape. It's amazing what you can fix with that. I always take a U-bolt with me too. I've had a couple of these break over the years, so well worth taking one of them. Always take a bolt. It looks rather odd, but this is actually for your leaf springs. So if one of them snaps, you've got a spare, because you're pretty stuffed if that happens. Hasn't happened to me yet, but I just take that as a little bit of a, I guess, good luck charm. Now, the one thing that I didn't take on my last trip, and I thoroughly regret, is one of these. This is a fan belt, and Geoff was incredibly naughty because I didn't take one with me. Now, I've had one in the vehicle for 5 years, and I've never ever snapped a fan belt. But I took it out a couple months ago because I actually used it on the spare one on the Series 3, and I didn't replace it. So what happened? Well, I finished the Holland track, and I got my compressor, and I went to get ready to pump up the tyres because the track's pretty corrugated. And then I thought, well, I probably should start the engine up because it's going to drain the battery a bit. Good idea, Geoff. So I went inside the car and I pressed the starter button, because that's what you do, these have a starter button. And the engine came to life, and then there was a bang. And I switched it off and I went, what was that? And I walked out, around the front of the car, the compressor box was sitting there. It was a little bit closer to the radiator because it sat it on the flat part in between the two wings. And then I looked at the fan and it wasn't spinning. The motor had just stopped. Usually, as it slows down, you see it spin. No. What I could see round it was actually the electrical cables and the alligator clips from the compressor. They were wrapped right around the water pump housing, and that actually snapped. You get the picture. Snapped the fan belt, and I didn't have a spare, and I was 60 kilometres away from the nearest town. So what's that in miles? Probably 35 miles. No mobile reception. I had an EPIRB with me, and that was it. I was like, bugger. And it was pretty hot. It would have been about 35 degrees, which is probably 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more. So what was I going to do? And this is one of the important things. It doesn't matter what vehicle you have, it's when you get in those situations, it's what you do next that makes all the difference. So what I did is I calmed down. I was pretty frustrated, but I will admit, I just calmed down. I just had a drink of water, had some lunch, and just sat for a bit and just let everything soak in. I wasn't worried because I was on the side of a road that I knew a lot of traffic went down. So, it might be a few hours, it might be half a day, but someone's going to come along and no doubt they're going to be able to help me out a little bit. But I thought about what kind of kit did I actually have with me that would be able to fix it. And I thought, well, I've got duct tape, I could maybe just tape the belt together and maybe that'd do. Okay, so I gave that a go. It didn't work. Okay, that was a mistake, but I learnt from that. And then I thought, well, I need to make a really strong belt of some kind that's going to be able to turn the water pump over. I don't care about the alternator. I know I can drive for an entire week without the alternator working. I've done it before. So what could I use? Many of you know that you can use stockings, but obviously I don't wear stockings, so that was a bit of a problem. And I thought, what about rope? I'd put up my canvas tarpaulin as I showed you in the first episode of Trip Prep. What about that? Let's have a look. And what I came up with, to cut a long story short, is I had some nylon cord that I used as guide ropes. And what I did, it wasn't easy, and I'm not going to say that it was a walk in the park. It wasn't. It was very frustrating. It took about 6 attempts, but I actually got one that worked. And this is one of the prototypes that didn't work. Basically, I wrapped it round the crank pulley down the bottom, got it over the water pump, pushed the alternator right up against the engine block, and then just pulled back on it, on the alternator, until it was the right tension. then cracked the pinch bolt so it was nice and tight, and then fired up the motor. And that was enough to give enough revolutions of the water pump to actually pump the water around the engine to stop it from overheating. And I got about 30 kilometres before the actual nylon gave out, and then I had to make another 2 or 3, and that got me into Coolgardie. And there I had mobile reception, and I was able to call a friend, and he came out with a spare fan belt, and I fitted it to the Series 2 and I drove home. So there you go. So, you know, it is really about using your toolkit to the best of your ability. And one thing before I go is I carry this little suitcase here, and this is a great little suitcase full of goodies. And I'll open it up for you, because the one thing I haven't talked about is electrical issues, and these do happen, particularly in these vehicles. This vehicle's caught on fire 3 times since I've had it. So this is pretty much all my spare parts and kit. There's my feeler gauges there. So feeler gauges, I've got spark plugs are a good one too. I've got steel wool. Now steel wool's really handy. What I can actually do is I can put 2 wires from the battery onto the steel wool, and I can use that to actually start a fire. So if I'm stuck somewhere and I forgot matches or flint or whatever, I've got some way of getting myself out of trouble. Obviously always carry a spare pair of points. Radiator stop leak is a good one. It's getting a bit fancy, but heat shrink is a good one too. More points, and obviously globes. Now obviously they're for brake, and then I carry extras for indicators and park lights, which obviously, if you don't know, your brake lights here in Australia at least have dual filaments, and obviously indicator and park lights don't, just in case you didn't know. An assortment of hose clamps are really good too. It's amazing what you can do with those. Just miscellaneous pieces of wire are really good also. I keep these because I usually take a couple 6-volt batteries with me. So if the battery inside the Series 2 dies, what I can actually do, and I've showed this in a previous video, is I can hook up the 2 or even 1 6-volt batteries and hook that directly onto the coil and use the crank handle to actually turn the motor over, and then the car will start up, and then that'll start actually charging the main battery or the crank battery. And as I showed with the Series 3, if you don't have a crank handle, because that does happen, you can actually jack the back wheel of the vehicle up and actually turn it over. Now obviously I've got fuses in here too, number of different fuses, blade fuses, because I have got a proper fuse box in the Series 2, fuses for the Series 3, always keep a roll of Teflon tape, really handy, assortment of nuts and bolts, wheel bearings, because sometimes they can fail, never had it happen, but always pays to be cautious, and electrical wire. Now electrical wire is really good obviously for fixing electrical issues, but it's actually even better than that. If your exhaust, for example, falls off the back of your car, which has happened to me twice now, this is the stuff to actually hold it in place. Fencing wire is too rigid. If you bolt it directly to the chassis, that'll actually cause fatigue fractures to go right through the exhaust system and will actually damage the entire system, which you'll have to replace. How do I know this? Because I've done it and I've made that mistake. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt if you like. Obviously, more stub axle seals of the neoprene variety. Paint pen is fantastic, and obviously it's a very funny multimeter. It looks like it's come out of a Kinder Surprise, but it does everything I need it to do. I think it was $20, but they do the job. And another great kit from Repco. This is a electrical terminal kit. And I do also carry a crimp and wire stripping tool, so I can basically do all the basic electrical needs that I need to do out in the bush. So that's pretty much everything that I take just for 4 days. If I go away for longer, then I usually take a box, like a wolf pack or an ammo box, full of other spare parts, and that'll be like suspension bushes, extra fuel filters. I always take an extra oil filter depending on how many Ks I'm doing. If it's over 5,000, then I'll do an oil change on it. That's very rare and seldom. So that's pretty much it in regards to toolkit. So there's quite a lot there. The weight of it is pretty minimal. I'm constantly trying to find ways of obviously minimizing it, but at the same time making sure it's incredibly effective. One thing I will say, and I'll just go get it and nip back, because this is revolutionary. And on our last big trip in Tassie, Damon and myself, Damon had purchased one of the Ryobi 1 kit. Now, look, as I said before, it doesn't matter about the brand, as long as it does the job. And I know some of you are diehard Milwaukee fans, Makita, DeWalt, whatever. It doesn't really matter. As long as the thing spins, that's what really matters. Great kit. I paid, I think, $500 for it, and within the first half an hour it had paid itself off. It is so easy. Instead of, even in your workshop, instead of having to fire up the air compressor, I can just pop a battery in and take a wheel off, piece of cake. And even out in the bush, it's fantastic. So if I'm doing a longer trip, I always take my rattle gun with me. And the other thing that's really handy too is a good work light. And this is great. You've got a hook at the end so you can hang it. You can obviously fold it. And the good thing about it is too, is with the operation, you can just get one element to actually work. So you can actually save, save the battery and get more out of it. So I'd recommend looking at one of those if you're doing a longer trip, because it does save a lot of time, a lot of hassle and a lot of effort. So yeah. So anyway, that's typically what I take for a 4-day trip in regards to tools. And look, if you think I've missed a few things, if you think that you've got a few things that work really well for you, then don't just tell me. Tell the World Wide Web and put a comment down below, because that's what we're about here at Seriously Series. It's about sharing information. And anyway, I hope you found this video of use for you. And for those of you out there who are restoring a vehicle of this nature, whatever make or model it can be, hopefully this has given you a bit of inspiration for that next big trip that you're going to do, and what tools, what kit and all the rest you should be looking at to take with you. Anyway, if you've been enjoying the content here at Seriously Series, then please do consider supporting us. All proceeds go to obviously producing these videos and a heck of a lot more. And you can do that by visiting us on Patreon by clicking on the Patreon icon at the top right hand corner of your screen. And you can also support us via PayPal by clicking on the web link in the content section down below to our website at seriouslyseries.com.au. Or if you're new to the channel and just trying to figure out who we are and all the rest, then be sure to click on that subscribe button. Be sure to click on that notification button too. And that way you won't miss out on one single video. Anyway, hope to see you in our next video.